incredibly compelling assertion for including indigenous cultures as the foundational cultures of Canada to the recent debates about cultural appropriation at all.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's a provocative question, right? I hope my answer may be provocative too. I don't know, let's see. It's a great question, but I think it goes back to, in a sense, E. Pauline Johnson and her call in 1892 for white writers to actually embrace the writing of indigenous characters. Keep in mind that there weren't that many indigenous writers at the time in 1892, right? So basically she's arguing at that point, more than 100 years ago, of course, that white writers, if they're going to write about indigenous people's characters, have a responsibility to get to know some First Nations realities, communities, indigenous peoples in general. And she did lambaste what she saw as being their incorrect portraitures and their tendencies in writing about romantic tales to always create this victimized native heroine who's always considering suicide or actually committing suicide. And she canvasses 5 or 6 different writers of that period to critique their depictions. And in fact, she uses that phrase, reveling of character, positively to suggest that given the presence at that point of 122,000 indigenous people in the country, that there was plenty of characters for white writers to think about writing about or trying to write about that would allow them to avoid cliche depictions. So she's actually calling for, I wouldn't say cultural appropriation, but for respectful interaction, intellectual interaction between white European, Canadian writers, intellectuals, and indigenous peoples. And she doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of the difficulties of actually having the mechanisms in place in terms of First Nations cultures to be able to monitor and rebut and refute negative and stereotypical depictions of their peoples, their nations, and so on. But still, as an Indigenous writer herself, she feels that it's her role at that point to demand that if white writers are going to be talking about Indigenous people, that they do it from a fact-based, not alternative facts, but fact-based approach. Given the fact that she was dealing with a situation where there were lots of white writers writing about Native people. So she was demanding to get it right. Fast forward to the present. Happily, there is a cadre, there's a core of Indigenous writers and other artists who are able to give real expression to their own experiences, so on and so forth. And happily, they have more and more access to the means of dissemination of their cultural context, histories, and stories, and so forth. And also a greater ability to critique publicly white writers who run afoul, as far as or white artists who run afoul of what they may consider to be appropriate renditions of their stories and so on. And so, in a sense, we've done a 180-degree turn from where E. Pauline Johnson was in 1892 to the point where some Indigenous intellectuals would prefer that white writers restrict themselves to writing about what they should know better themselves in their communities, and leave Indigenous peoples the power and ability to write about their stories for themselves, without having to go through the filter of some kind of white amanuensis intervention, so to speak. And in the sense of thinking about the transition from, keeping in mind the transition from slave narratives that were edited by whites and prefaced by whites as a means of authenticating, strangely authenticating black slave experience, with the idea that white writers might be able to objectively give a presentation on indigenous cultures or on indigeneity, or that their word can be taken as being more accurate, more objective, more professional, quotation, et cetera, et cetera. And just as African folks have had to reject and rewrite and counter centuries of those kinds of often very pernicious writings and stereotypes about slaves, about ex-slaves, about slave resistors like Nat Turner, for crying out loud. So do First Nations writers, Indigenous intellectuals find themselves in a similar situation right now today. And it is a radical pushback against centuries of misrepresentation and presentation of Indigenous realities. So to go to the next provocative point, does this mean that nobody should be able to write about anybody if they have not had direct experience of that other culture, in quotation mark, whatever it might be? I would say no. I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in the freedom of imagination. But I also believe in responsibility. And I'm going to fall back on the Constitution. Because remember, we got rights and freedoms, but they come with that clause that only as deemed responsible in a free democratic society. So you got that other clause there. Notwithstanding. Right? There's also a need for some responsibility and humility. I mean, how dare anybody think, I'm going to pick up a pen and I'm going to write about the lives of Chinese railway workers in the Rockies, and not bother to do any kind of research, not bother to do any kind of empathetic consideration of their cultures, their language, aspects of themselves, artifacts that they may have left behind, and so on, that attest to their story, as well as investigating, exploring, critiquing the attitudes of the government of the day, John A. Macdonald, the federal political parties, so the government of British Columbia, which was at the time virulently anti-Asian, anti-Chinese, anti-Indian, anti-First Nations, for crying out loud. So there's plenty there for anyone who wanted to investigate that story who didn't have to be Chinese, Canadian, or Asian heritage or connected with that story to look at if he or she wanted to do that. So I think I personally I am very comfortable with the idea that anybody can tell anybody you can't write about this. I have problems with that. At the same time, I certainly support the idea that if you're going to try to undertake the writing on some other cultural experience, you had better become as educated as you possibly can, with a degree of humility, a lot of humility, in terms of taking up your pen and setting down your laptop and getting to work on attempting to cover those other experiences. And you should also question your own motivations. What is it all about? Is it really an attempt to understand, to be empathetic, or is it an attempt to sensationalize and possibly make a quick tune, given the volume of gloom? So, that's another aspect to keep in mind.
In a lecture about the Constitution of Canada, it is completely appropriate that we end by invoking the notwithstanding clause. And with that, I want to thank Professor Clarke very much for his provocations